Good evening and welcome to tonight's Undaunted, bringing you to the news on top stories. I am Oyi Okbala. Let's begin. The security and social-political situation in southern Cameroon continues to raise serious concern as fresh reports of killings, kidnappings, and growing public frustration emerge from several communities. In Jakiri, 3 civilians are reportedly said to have been arrested and later killed, with their bodies allegedly dumped in Bamessing. 2 of their victims have since been identified according to local sources. The incident has sparked renewed concerns over the safety of civilians amidst persistent insecurity in southern Cameroon. Meanwhile, residents in Kumbo are facing increasing fear as kidnappings for ransom intensifies, leaving families and communities increasingly vulnerable. The growing insecurity has added to concerns over movement, livelihood, and the protection of civilians. In the southern Cameroon, residents of Buea have taken to the streets to protest prolonged power outages, expressing frustration over the impact of unreliable electricity on households, businesses, and essential services. At the political level, colonial mayors are also coming under mounting pressure, with questions being raised over governance, accountability, and the administration of local councils. Together, the development paints a troubling picture of communities grappling with insecurity, inadequate public services, and growing demands for accountability from those in positions of authorities. Now let's get the news in full briefings, but first, the prime headlines. Killed in Jakiri, Undaunted, Bamessing, 2 victims has been identified so far. Also tonight, colonial mayors on hot seat. Tonight on Undaunted, residents protest prolonged power outages in Buea. Tonight we take a look at the kidnappings for ransom identified in Kumbo as residents face growing insecurities. 65 civil society groups urge Jakiri to drop DRC constitutional referendum on the African scene, while on the global scene, WHO defends childhood immunization schedules after Trump orders fewer vaccines. Now let's get the news in full briefings. Three civilians allegedly abducted by French Cameroon government forces in Jakiri were later killed and their bodies dumped in Bamessing in Gokentuja County. Well, according to sources familiar with the incident, the killings took place last week. The bodies were left in Bamessing with guns placed beside them in what was presented as evidence that they were Ambazonian State Army. However, residents of Bamessing said they could not identify the men. 2 of the 3 victims have been identified. They are Abdul, Karimo, and Hassan, also known as Alaji. A source said the 3 men were abducted during a French-Cameroon military operation in Zaramiyam, Jakiri, several weeks before their deaths. They were then allegedly transported from Jakiri to Bamessing, where they were shot dead. The guns were intentionally placed on their bodies after the killings to present them as armed fighters, the sources alleged. The source described all three men as civilians and not fighters. Well, according to sources, Karimo had been arrested twice before in connection with the ongoing war. He was allegedly made to pay 3 million francs CFA and 2 million CFA francs for his release on those occasions. The sources added that Karimo had recently returned from Dubai shortly after his final arrest. The exact circumstances surrounding the abductions and killings, including which military unit was involved and whether the men were armed at the time of abduction, could not be independently verified. Military authorities in Buea and in Nkokentuje counties had not responded to requests for comment at the time of publication. Human rights groups have repeatedly called for independent investigations into allegations of extrajudicial killings and the planting of evidence in southern Cameroon. Away from that, let's get into Bamenda, where the French Cameroon Ministry of Finance has launched a formal investigation into the colonial Bamenda City Council and the councils of Bamenda over allegations of corruption and the prolonged non-payment of workers' salaries. Undaunted had learned. Well, according to official documents obtained, a special investigation team dispatched by Finance Minister Louise Paul Motaze is currently on the ground in Bamenda. The team is expected to submit its findings to the minister by Wednesday, August 12, 2026. The probe covers all 4 councils in the Mbesha capital and centers on 2 major issues: suspected financial mismanagement and what the ministry describes as the abusive rejection of personnel salary files at the Bamenda Council. Leading the investigation is Anonche Khan, assisted by Inchair Patrick Akwor and Mukete Mikel. A key part of their mandate is to establish why hundreds of council workers have gone for months without pay, despite a court ruling that other salary adjustments in line with national regulations. Council staff who spoke alleged that their plight is being deliberately prolonged by both the supervisory authority and financial controllers. They specifically accused the senior divisional officer for Mbesha Simeon and Mole Mill and the council finance controller refused to approve salary files. Well, according to eyewitness, they say for several months now, the workers of Bamenda and 3 have been without salaries just because the finance controller has refused to sign off on their salary payments, one staff representative told Undaunted. While the workers also alleged that during a meeting, the colonial SDO told their representatives that his workers don't have such salaries, so why should council workers receive more than their salaries? Well, the workers further stated that the court had already ruled in their favor regarding salary adjustments, but the ruling has not been implemented. The investigation comes amid growing frustration in Bamenda, where council workers say the salary crisis has left families struggling to meet basic needs. The Ministry of Finance is expected to take disciplinary and corrective measures based on the report to be submitted next week. Neither the Colonial SDO's office nor the councils involved had responded to requests for comments at the time of reports. Well, the outcome of this investigation will be closely watched, as it could set a precedent for how salary disputes and alleged corruptions are handled in decentralized councils across the southern Cameroons. Oh, well, residents of Outages and Bunduma in Buea County, Cameroon, southern Cameroon, have taken to the streets again to protest prolonged electricity outages in their communities. On Tuesday, residents barricaded the upper Bunduma Road, disrupting traffic in the area. The road linking Buea and Limbe through Sasei was also blocked as protesters expressed their frustration over what they described as weeks without electricity. The demonstrators are demanding the immediate restoration of power, saying the prolonged outages have disrupted daily life and affected households and businesses across the affected communities. The road blockades, however, were short-lived. Police officers intervened and cleared the barricades, allowing traffic to resume. The latest protest comes amid renewed concerns over recurring electricity disruptions in Buea and surrounding communities. Residents say the outages are becoming increasingly frequent, raising fears that the city could be heading back to a period of prolonged power cuts witnessed in recent months. In the late 2025, several neighborhoods in and around Buea were hit by persistent blackouts, prompting residents to stage street protests and block major roads in an attempt to draw attention to their plight. The demonstrations eventually subsided after electricity was restored to many of the affected areas. But months later, residents say the problem is resurfacing. The renewed protests in Wututu and Bunduma highlights growing frustration over communities that depend on a stable electricity supply for domestic activities, businesses, education, and other essential services. For residents, the latest road blockades are a sign of mounting anger over what they consider prolonged neglect and a lack of a lasting solution to recurring power outages. The authorities and electricity providers are yet to publicly announce a long-term solution to the latest disruptions. As the blackouts continue, residents fear that further outages could trigger more street protests in Buea and other affected communities if power is not restored promptly. Let's head into Kumbo, where residents of Kumbo, particularly in Chuban, say kidnappings for ransom have become a growing threat, with armed fighters from different camps targeting civilians and demanding millions of francs CFA for their release. While residents say some victims are being abducted repeatedly, sometimes by different unknown gunmen shortly after their release. One reported case involves an elderly businessman who has allegedly been kidnapped several times. During one incident, he was reportedly tied up and forced to surrender goods from his shop. He was later abducted again while attempting to leave Kumbo with his wife. The growing insecurity has also made it increasingly difficult for civilians to report abuses, as residents fear reprisals from either armed men or government forces. In Toben, residents say the reported withdrawal of BEE's personnel has left communities feeling more exposed, with armed fighters, unknown gunmen moving through neighborhoods and abducting people from the streets and homes. The insecurity is also taking a heavy economic toll. Businesses are reportedly being abducted, families are relocating, and poverty values are declining as residents seek safer places to live. Residents say repeated kidnappings, ransom demands, and the presence of rival armed groups have created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty across Kumbo. The situation underscores the growing vulnerability of the civilians in parts of Buea, where years of armed war have disrupted livelihoods and weakened local security. Residents are calling for urgent action to restore security and protect civilians from further abductions and extortions. Oh well, that's all we have for you from news from the home front. When we return from the short break, we'll head into the African news, where 65 civil society organizations in the Democratic Republic of Congo have called on the president to abandon plans for constitutional referendum. 65 civil society organizations in the Democratic Republic of Congo have called on President Felix Tshisekedi to abandon plans for a constitutional referendum, arguing that the country's deepening insecurity, humanitarian and economic crisis could take priority. In a memorandum sent on Monday to President Jakiri and the country's principal state institutions, the organization warned that proceeding with a referendum at a time of severe national hardship could divert scarce public resources and risk further aggravating political tensions. The group cited the continued conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where fighting has forced millions of people from their homes and created a worsening humanitarian emergency. They also pointed to deteriorating living conditions and mounting economic pressure facing ordinary people. Well, according to the organization, the government should focus its attention and resources on addressing insecurity, supporting displaced communities, and improving social and economic conditions rather than pursuing constitutional changes. The civil society groups also expressed concern over the proposed referendum law, saying it could be interpreted as an initial move towards altering the country's constitution. They warned that such a process, if undertaken without broad political and public consensus, could intensify division in an already politically sensitive environment. The appeal comes as President Tshisekedi faces growing pressure over the government's handling of the conflicts in the East and the broader economic and humanitarian challenges confronting the country. The organization urged the president and state institutions to prioritize national stability and the immediate need of the population. They called for greater consultation with citizens and political stakeholders before any decision is taken on changes to the constitutional framework. The proposed referendum has the potential to become a major political issue in the DRC, particularly if opposition parties and civil society groups view it as an attempt to reshape the country's political system. For the 65th organizations, however, the immediate priority is clear. Resources should be directed towards ending war, assisting millions of displaced people, and easing the economic hardship affecting communities across the country. They said pursuing a constitutional referendum on the current circumstances could undermine public confidence in a state institution and deepen political tensions at a time when the country is already facing significant challenges. Well, away from that, when we return from this break, we'll head into the globe, where the World Health Organization has defended established childhood immunization schedule after U.S. presidents. The World Health Organization has defended established childhood immunization schedule after President Donald Trump signed an executive order seeking to reduce the number of vaccines routinely recommended for children in the United States. The WHO said its vaccination recommendations are based on decades of scientific research and are developed through expert review, including advice from a strategic advisory group of experts on immunization. The organization stressed that immunization schedules are designed according to the health risks, disease patterns, and healthcare systems of individual countries. Trump's latest order calls for the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule to focus on protection against diseases, reducing the number of diseases covered by routine recommendation. Several other victims would instead be recommended for children considered to be at higher risk or through discussions between parents and healthcare providers. The order also directs changes to the widely used measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, calling for the three components to be administered as separate shots rather than as a combined vaccine. Public health experts and vaccine manufacturers have questioned the scientific basis for the change, warning that requiring additional medical visits could create delays and make it harder for some children to receive all recommended doses. The Trump administration has argued that the revised approach would give parents greater choice and bring the United States closer to vaccination practices in other developed countries. An administration-backed review released earlier this year argued that the U.S. had been an outlier among peer nations in the number of diseases included in its childhood vaccination program. Health authorities and medical experts, however, have cautioned against directly comparing national vaccination schedules without considering differences in disease prevalence, healthcare access, and public health priorities. They say the long-standing schedules have been developed to provide protection against serious and potentially preventable diseases at ages when children are most vulnerable. The debate comes amid continued concerns over vaccine-preventable diseases, including measles. Critics of the new policy fear that reducing routine recommendations are creating additional barriers to vaccination, which could lower immunization coverage and leave more children vulnerable to outbreaks. The WHO's position shows the widening international debate over the Trump administration changes to U.S. vaccine policy, while Washington moves to narrow routine recommendations. The global health body maintains that childhood immunization schedules could remain grounded in the best available scientific evidence and adapted to the specific health needs of each population. Well, that's it for tonight's Undaunted, bringing it to the news Untold Stories. But before we go, let's take a look at the stories that made it to tonight's headlines. Well, tonight on Undaunted, we told you that 3 civilians allegedly arrested in Jakiri, killed and dumped in Bamessing. 2 victims has been identified so far. Also tonight, we told you that colonial mayors are on hot seat. Tonight, we told you that residents protest prolonged power outages in Buea. Tonight on Undaunted, kidnappings for ransom intensifies in Kumbo as residents face growing insecurity, while 65 civil society groups has urged Jakiri to drop DRC's constitutional referendum plan that was on the African scene. While on the global scene, we told you that WHO defends childhood immunization schedules after Trump's orders fewer vaccines. That's it for tonight on Undaunted. Sincere apologies for not being able to have Barrister Mbesha, but hopefully tomorrow we will. And on behalf of the technical team behind tonight's production, it's good night and God bless you.